Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Psychology of Business podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brandon Griffin, and joining me in my virtual studio today is Dr. Susan R. Madsen. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Before we get into what we're going to talk about today, could you introduce who you are, what you're working on, and what your background is?
Oh, those are big questions, Brandon. I am a professor, a leadership women scholar, and do lots of research around women and leadership. But also, I have gotten through the years into doing so much research about gender and all things girls and women. And so I'm the Karen Haid Huntsman Endowed Professor of Leadership in the John M. Huntsman School of Business at Utah State University. So I teach a little bit. I teach leadership. I'm a leadership professor and teach women in business classes and so forth. But most of my time these days is really spent on taking research. I continue to conduct studies and guide major research in the state of Utah. So the foundation is research. And in addition to that, working on and leading efforts around societal change, for girls and women in the state. So taking my academic work and my academic research and moving it into practice so that we can actually strengthen the impact of girls and women here in the state of Utah. I have for decades traveled and done a lot of speaking and some research through the years in various countries around the world. And so even this year, I've spoken in a few countries around the world. The Utah work is taking more of my time right now, so I'm not doing quite as much of that. But I have been known as a top women in leadership scholar globally as well. So I've published 9 books, some edited books through the years. And then I do a lot of writing in terms of reports that go out to the general public, editorials, op-eds for newspapers, magazines, and so forth. So it keeps me busy.
Well, good. With a background like that, I'm sure you have a lot to give us in this interview, but thank you so much for coming on and sharing your insights and what you're working on.
Sure.
So, Dr. Madsen, on your profile, when I look online, it sounds like there are 2 things that you're associated with. Obviously, your professional job at Utah State, but that really focuses on the Utah Women in Leadership Project and an initiative called A Bolder Way Forward. But before we talk about those, could you give us kind of a breakdown of why the study of women and gender in leadership is so important? I think a lot of people understand, it's kind of this idea that there's a pay gap, there's a glass ceiling. But why is it so important to study, and what have you spent your entire career working on?
Absolutely. So if you've read books like Invisible Women on data and other kinds of books, you know that, and just as a mother, as an individual who works with men and women, we know there's a big difference between men and women in terms of so many things, in terms of even what we're passionate about sometimes, not always, but how we do things, how we're socialized, growing up and so forth. So the book Invisible Women, I really appreciate that book because it talks about data and how throughout time, men are the ones that are in research studies. And most of the decisions that have been made are based on boys and men, not girls and women. Yet physically, psychologically, mentally, in all ways, there's really differences between men and women. So in the business realm, and this podcast is mostly for people interested in business. And when we get into the social sciences, pretty much everything has differences when you get into gender. And so if you're not studying it, if you're not really looking at it, we don't serve everybody equally. So we have to do work on boys and men, which a lot of work has been done, and there's people doing that, and girls and women. And if we don't do that, we're just missing the boat. Honestly, we are. We have to, things are just different. Workplace experiences are very different for men and women. And if you just assume everybody's the same, you may do okay with some things, but you're going to be missing a lot, because women's experiences navigating workplace environments are so different than men's.
Definitely. So there's obviously differences between men and women, but what are some of the inequalities that women experience that, I mentioned some of the more visible ones or ones that maybe people are more familiar with, but what are some of the inequalities that are experienced with women at work?
Well, in general, representation's the biggest one. So there's definitely more men in leadership than women. And as you mentioned, the pay gap is one of those things as well. The workplace experience is very different in terms of pay. The utilization, the desire to have flexible workplace policies and initiatives and so forth. There's more men, I think, these days that want them, but generally speaking, women throughout time have needed and wanted more flexibility. And so when organizations are not flexible, it's really a challenge to women. So there's just, so many different things. In the business realm, entrepreneurship is different for women and men. Things like leadership development, even the opportunities for leadership development are different. And oftentimes organizations do one leadership development program, but this is part of my expertise, right? You actually develop leadership differently. And so I tell people all the time, do general leadership development, but women really need to at least once do a women's only leadership development, because you are not able to talk about things that women more often talk about. In terms of socialization, in terms of family-friendly kinds of things, in terms of challenges with children and trying to do it all, right? All of those things are really, really important. And so, when you get into different industries too, like STEM, there's a big difference in terms of the representation of women in STEM fields, and that impacts so many different things. And then, of course, many things within the workforce development we research and look at that. In the state of Utah, for example, in the workforce development, more women are interested in returning back to the workforce. And so companies that just do generally the things that they've always done are not going to be able to utilize this amazing force of well-prepared women, right? That maybe want to work professionally, but work part-time. So if a company is only focused on lower level part-time positions, and then really the full-time positions for people that are, quote, committed, right? Then they're going to be missing the boat. Some companies in Utah now are implementing returnships because we have a talent shortage here, and really looking at shaking things up and saying, do we need only full-time people in professional roles, or can we implement job sharing and different kinds of things like that? So there's a lot of challenges. And of course, we look at challenges like violence, so domestic violence, sexual assault, those kinds of things. And sometimes people say, well, that doesn't really go in workplace conversations. Actually, everything does. If you try to separate workplace experiences and life experience, this, it doesn't always work. So those are a few things. But the whole area that underpins everything is sexism. And that's not only men, it's more men sexism, but women can be sexist against other women as well. But the sexism that's often invisible in workplaces, particularly more masculine workplaces, that's the underpinning of lots of inequality and inequity in workplaces today.
So that was a really good point you brought up. I was talking to my wife this morning as I was preparing for this interview, and something I mentioned is obviously when we're talking about inequalities in the workplace, there has to be someone in a position of power and someone who's, on the receiving end of that power, someone on the receiving end of that inequality. So you mentioned that men oftentimes, I don't want to say perpetrator if that's the right word, but men's oftentimes are the one who are enacting this systemic inequality. But you said women can do that as well. Why is that? It seems like just something really interesting there.
Yeah, well, we have done extensive research on sexism, and especially with the work I'm doing in Utah, collected data with over 1,000 women in the state of Utah years ago. And we've published 5 different reports that are really fascinating to read because they actually give quotes and we have themes sectioned out so we can say, what is his theme? Here are some quotes so we can learn for women and men, right? Both of us. We can all learn. And so we found about 85% of the sexist comments were coming from men. That wasn't a surprise. But we found about 15% were coming from women, other women. And so let me talk about, if I can kind of take us in a direction that maybe your listeners would find interesting. So in the realm of sexism, the research divides it into two areas. One is hostile sexism, and the other one is called benevolent sexism. The hostile sexism is really the blunt things, whether it's sexual harassment, whether it's those kinds of things, but also just the assumptions that women will take notes at all meetings, or just expecting women will do certain things, or saying, hey, that's women's work, or, those are pretty blunt. But this benevolent sexism is really interesting. Of course, men do this more than women, but women can do this as well. And I think I've had to catch myself, honestly, a few times when I've done it. So benevolent sexism are really coming from a good place, but it's really protecting, assuming and protecting women when it's not really our job to be doing that. For instance, if you as a manager have a great woman employee, but she has maybe 3 kids at home, you might think, well, I would love to have her come to this evening event where our CEO will be there and corporate board members will be there, and she could network. And then you think, wait, she's got 3 kids and I know she wants to be with them. And so you don't even ask her. But there's a man with 3 kids and you're like, oh, it's easier somehow for him to get out. And so you just go, sometimes unconsciously, and people are like, well, that's nice of him to do that. Well, actually, when you think about it, what is she missing out on? Networking, professional development, all kinds of things that could advance her career that she doesn't even get the option for. She doesn't even get the choice, right? So in that situation, men often do that, but women could do that as well. I remember those days when I had 3 kids at home. I have 4 kids. And that was hard. So I could kind of protect a woman. And benevolent sexism comes from a good place. And in my culture in Utah, it's actually very taught for men to do this. Yet we know that it is discrimination in various kinds of ways, and it perpetuates men getting more opportunities than women. And so there's many different examples of like benevolent sexism. Even the research around if I had 2 great employees, a man and a woman, ask me to write a letter of recommendation, and they're both equal. If I'm not paying attention, I'll use different words for the man than I would for the woman. And the man would be driven, gets the job done, strong, these masculine words. And the woman, I'll be nice too, but it'll be teamwork and collaboration and kind and compassionate. And when you get right down to it, who gets the promotion, who gets the recognition, it will be the man. That's what all of us look at, are those stronger words. So those are a few examples. I know I've spent some good time on that, but these are important. Sometimes even those subtler things that we do can make as big of an impact, right? And of course, women would rather have benevolent sexism than hostile sexism. If we had to choose, we would go down that route of benevolent sexism because it's done oftentimes from a well-meaning heart, right?
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like this benevolent sexism is somewhat of an implicit bias where you don't even know it occurs, where you want to be nice, you want to take care of them. But if I'm a manager, I might be saying to myself, I'm not sexist. I treat all of my employees the same. I try to, do what I'm supposed to. I don't discriminate against men and women. Is that the right approach, to treat everyone the same? Or how can I be better as a manager?
Well, we don't treat everybody the same.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, anytime people say that, we know that they're not understanding their biases. Because when you get into, and I've taught and researched unconscious bias for years and years, because you can't really understand sexism unless we get down to our biases. And so we can never honestly treat everybody the same. We think and the more we know about bias, the more we understand we can't, and the more we're more aware and really try. But anybody that says, I treat everybody the same, I just know that they have no clue. So, because I don't, and I work on it all the time, right? So just subtle little things create biases. I mean, the gifts that we give at Christmas to our daughters and sons are different, and those create biases. So many things. For instance, when I teach unconscious bias, there's been a few studies on people that interview other people and whether they're holding a hot drink or a cold drink in their hands. And people with hot drinks typically treat, and there's been a few different studies, are more positive toward the people they're interviewing than if I had a cold drink in my hand. So that is subtle, right? That's subtle, but there's things going on there. So the more that we understand that we have biases, the more we can actually bring that unconscious a little bit to conscious and try to really make a difference there. So we don't treat women and men the same. We don't treat people of different races the same. But we can try. We can try, right? If it's on our radar, we can try the best we can and get better and better at doing that. But I've learned to be really careful in saying I treat everybody the same because we just know we don't, and it's all based on how we were socialized. It's very complex.
Definitely. So I think that's a unique problem in the United States as a whole, but why do you focus specifically on the state of Utah? Is it just that's your geographic location, or is there something unique about the state of Utah?
Well, I would say that a number of years ago, I really started to do some work in Utah, and I was asked by the Commissioner of Higher Education, actually, in 2009, and by the Governor's Education Excellence Commission to do some research at that time on why more women weren't graduating from college compared to the nation. And so I dug in, did research statewide there, and I had been only doing global work until that point. And then my two scholarship areas are really women, gender, and then the others is organization development and change. And I've moved into societal change. So societal change is not just an interest, it's an area of scholarship for me. And so as I started this about 15 years ago, I tried to close the loop many times because it was supposed to be a one-year project. But people really wanted the data. Then they would ask for more data. I kept doing it, trying to close the loop. But I have to be one of the areas that I have researched on and read and written a few chapters on is the area of calling, of deeper purpose and calling. And there's some interesting research within more Christian religions and other areas about this calling area, and some religious, but you can feel called, and you don't need to be religious to feel called. And I will tell you that I happen to be religious myself and spiritual. I'll put both of those on the table because sometimes those aren't connected. Sometimes they are. And women more than men, if we feel called to do something, if we feel called to lead, if we feel called, we will step forward to do the work. Men too, but about 30% more women than men, some of the research has found. And so when you ask that question, I'll tell you that part of the work I do is paid. And a lot of the work I do is my community service. And all of that goes into a bucket that is very profound for me because I feel absolutely called to do so. So that's why, and as I have moved into my 60s now, you start, once you hit 60, and I'm a little bit older than 60, you start to think, what do I want to do, right, with the rest of my career and time? And so I've just in the past couple of years started really narrowing away from global work, although I published a book earlier this year, my last scholarly book, that's the Handbook of Research on Gender and Leadership. That's an awesome book and has authors from all over the world. But really feel called to continue my research, but actually change things for girls and women here in the state of Utah as well. So even though I'm a professor, I do a ton of work speaking in the community, working with nonprofits, working with the governor, working with the legislature, working with the commissioner of higher education, working with people on the ground, working with religious groups to do better. Not just those inequalities in the workplace, but other things as well, like safety and security, like education, like getting more women to run for office, serve on state commissions and boards, and just getting more women to lean in and engage in civic engagement, community engagement.
That's wonderful. I think finding your meaning, finding your purpose, finding your calling is going to be an increasing area of study.
I think more people want that. They want to do meaningful work.
Definitely. So meaningfulness is an area that I've researched a lot, and younger generations show that they want to do meaningful work. My motto is, I want to help you get a high-paying, meaningful job, because everyone always, the common cliche is like, oh, get a job that you love and you'll never work a day in your life. Well, that's true. Yes and no. Like, there's still going to be work. You can love your job. It can be the greatest thing in the world, but there's still going to be things you don't like about it. You could be a professional basketball player, but you're still going to have things that you don't like, that you don't enjoy. So I think meaningfulness from an individual employee level, but also meaningfulness in your situation is something great, because yes, you're getting compensated for your work, but like you said, you're doing a lot of community service above and beyond that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the actual state of women in leadership and society in general in the state of Utah. So what is your main focus right now? I know that's kind of the initiative of A Bolder Way Forward. I know that's a whole 10-hour long presentation.
Yeah.
But do you want to give us an overview of what that is really focusing on now as you're trying to turn this career of academic research into practical knowledge and change and innovation?
So it's been 15 years, like I said, since I created the Utah Women in Leadership Project. And the mission of that is to strengthen the impact of Utah girls and women. And we have always done that through, and for most of the years, it was me and one student, right? But I have more of a staff now. But it really is through producing relevant, trustworthy, applicable research. 3 things. That's the first. 2, creating and gathering valuable resources. And 3, convening training and events that inform, inspire, and ignite change and growth for Utahns. So I've been doing that for a lot of years. Well, a couple of years ago, that's when I turned 60. I have always been a hard worker, right? I work a lot, but doing all this research, we're not seeing the needle move much in the state of Utah. Even through all this research, I've gotten awards, all this stuff for my work. And I'm like, but if we're not seeing change, is this really doing the work for all the efforts that me and other people are putting in? So a couple of years ago, it was November 2022. I really looked at the change research and all of the things that I've been doing through my career and decided to think about, do I keep doing things the same way I'm doing them, or do I change? Either spend more time in Hawaii on the beach or change the strategy that I'm doing. And I read an awesome book that really inspired me called How Change Happens. Why some social movements succeed while others don't. And it really looked at national movements like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, like, decades ago when smoking was a big thing and that changed. So less and less people smoke. And then compared them with movements that started but really didn't do much. And what was the difference? And so this book, I read it on a couple flights to Costa Rica, a couple flights back. And by the time I landed, I had this term, a bolder way forward, a model, everything in mind for next steps. I spent the next month, because this is a big deal, it's a lot of work, talking to about 50 people and wrestling with it, and then decided that this was the way forward. Basically, I had looked at research, and I had done some things at the United Nations in past years where we looked at trajectories. Like how many years, how many decades would it take to reach parity or do this or that? Took that to Utah for the first time and really looked at the data. And it's like, to make notable progress, about 30 to 40 years. And I'm like, that's not acceptable for my daughter, for my 3 granddaughters, for even my 3 grandsons, in terms of violence, getting our violence rates down, getting our opportunities up. And so this movement is taking the changes that need to happen, and instead of 3 to 4 decades, say that if we can work with this systems thinking, Utah has a lot of pieces and parts, a lot of things happening, but we're not moving the needle. So systems is bringing things together in a way, whether they're partners in government, local or state, nonprofits, businesses, schools, universities, and so forth, church, faith-based organizations, bringing them together in a unique way where we can shift more powerfully together. So it's a 7-year movement. We're into year 2 right now, to take 7 years instead of 3 to 4 decades to make this notable change. And so we have at this point, I launched it actually a year and a half ago. Took me a bit to build it. We've spent the first year, and I have about 250 leaders now from all over the state. We didn't start from scratch in any of 18 areas. We call them spokes in the wheel of change, from health across the lifespan to domestic violence to pay gap to entrepreneurship to women in politics, all different areas, 18 areas. We spent the first year really figuring out what are the bold goals. And I'll tell you, figuring out how to measure those has been something else. And we have been laying the groundwork for that. We have started building. We have about 4,000 people engaged. We have county coalitions in all 29 of Utah's counties that are already functioning and up and going. We have other pieces too. So again, we have about 4,000 people engaged in the first year and a half, and we're just opening the floodgates. And so bringing together pretty much everybody in any of those settings that are doing work, from academics to just stay-at-home moms that are passionate about it, to top business leaders who say, wait, it's time. It's time to figure out how to make childcare more accessible and affordable in the state of Utah so that families can have more support. So that's a bit of it. It's a major thing, and it takes a lot of work. No other state has ever tried this or done this. And so we never, we're the worst state for women's equality in the Wallet Hub rankings. And we never may be the first, but as I tease people from time to time, at least we can get past Idaho, which has been the next worst state. Actually, Texas is now. So, but we can do a lot better. So it's an interesting initiative. And it's a bit of a monster. But when you feel called to do the work, you just lean in and you have faith, whatever that means to you. Again, I'm religious, but you don't have to be religious to feel called. That you can figure it out, that you'll have help, that you can find the right people to make the difference that needs to be made so that more girls and women actually thrive. And can I just say, a lot of times people, especially in my home state, say, if you, quote, empower women, then it will take away from families. Oh my gosh, the research actually says if more girls and women thrive, more families will thrive. So it's not the scarcity mentality. It's the abundance. When we lift, it doesn't take from us. If we lift other people, it doesn't take from us. We can lift and be lifted. So men can lift and support women, and that doesn't mean it doesn't mean that they are taken down. You can lift and be lifted. And so we're trying to teach that principle a lot. Thank you for asking about that. I'm very passionate about it, but we welcome everybody in. If you're working and care about Utah, we welcome everybody in, because just going and talking to your neighbors and helping them understand that certain issues are a problem, like violence, right? That's a really important one to me. We need to get the violence rates down. All states struggle with that, but unfortunately, more religious and conservative states often struggle even more with that, because there tends to be a different power dynamic between women and men in more conservative states. Anytime there's a bigger power dynamic between men and women, you tend to have higher rates of violence, unfortunately.
That's really interesting. So I grew up in the state of Utah. Utah is actually, for the first time ever, according to the study out of Utah Tech University, the dominant religion, or what is it, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which has traditionally been the dominant religion in Utah, isn't it less than 50% of the state now identifies as that? But I live in Alabama currently. Alabama's in the Bible Belt. It's very religious. So I think there's a lot of similarities between the two states, being heavily Christian. But I want to go back to something that you said earlier. So you said that a lot of people have this idea that if you empower women or help women and girls thrive, that it's going to somehow, shake things up. They look at things from a scarcity mentality. Is that because they see kind of the nuclear family, being changed? They have this idea of the mom's going to stay at home. They're going to raise the children. The dad's going to go out to work. And when he comes home at 6 o'clock, dinner's going to be at the table. And if somehow that's not there, things are going to be changed. Why are people scared of that?
I think that's a piece of it. I think that's a piece of it. But when you look at the demographics that are changing in Utah, and I would argue the rest of the country in some ways, that type of family unit is almost a luxury, because we have the cost of living here in Utah has skyrocketed. It is challenging to afford homes. And if there are two parents or two partners in the home, for the most part, there's not a lot of families that can have one of the partners be a full-time stay-at-home partner. Most of the time, you're at least, as a woman, working part-time. I mean, I did all through the years, not necessarily for funding, but some of us just need that, right? We love that. We love to work and contribute in those kinds of ways. But as I said, we have more of a workforce here that wants to work part-time, but wants to be professional as well. And so there's a real interesting dynamic here. So I think yeah, I think the history really dictates, and those people that are really stuck in the history and how it used to be and had stay at home. For instance, some of our legislators have had stay at home wives. Let's just say that. And so they're not supportive of child care efforts because in their minds they think, wait, that's the family's responsibility. That's a private issue, not a public issue. But I'll tell you, we are a childcare desert in the state of Utah, and childcare is a market failure, not just in the state of Utah, but around the nation. So it's so expensive. There's a lack of quality, but people who do childcare, who work in the childcare industry, don't make very much money. And so if there's not this in-between government support, which Utah doesn't provide much of, families are struggling. And so there's this understanding of really who are the people living in our state. What's the dynamic family looking like in the state of Utah, and what do we need? So not understanding that and just assuming that all families are the same, really causing us some trouble, and not just Utah, but other states as well. So yes, when you're used to women staying at home, doing those kinds of things, and only doing that, then you can have some false understanding of, just that assumption that women who go to work for even 40 hours a week are not good mothers. Oh, so much research on even the amount of time that is spent and so forth. So it is interesting and such a moving and shaken area, right? And more, especially in the younger generations, I think they're not assuming as men that that they're smarter, that they have to provide everything, although that's important. But working, the partnership model of really being in a partnership, if you have a spouse or a partner in the home, is the most healthy way to move forward in family environments. And you just decide how to do this. So all families are different, right?
That's definitely right. So there are two more places I want to go. I know I've had you on for a long time, but there are two more places I want to explore. How can men get involved in this work? I know as you're talking, that's something, I talk, or I'm thinking about. I want to get involved. I want to help at least champion women's success. But part of me is kind of like, go girls. I don't know what I can do, but go achieve.
Well, part of our model has, in every area that we're working on, has an underpinning of male allyship. If we don't have more men, and men are coming on board more and more, but it is like viewed often as a women's space. Well, actually, men have daughters, and men have spouses and partners, and men have mothers, right? And so this isn't just a women's issue. It's a human issue. It's a family issue. And so it's been really interesting. We have new curriculum that we've developed. Great curriculum actually was developed by a contractor, a man who has done a lot of work in the male allyship space. And I would recommend it. It is on our website. It's free. But you can do a video, and it's for really 3 to 5 men meet together, and they're conversations. And there's a video, but it stops and lets you talk, and then gives you an activity and lets you talk. And so there are 4 or 5 discussions. So you meet with the group, have a 45-minute experience, and then come back in a couple of weeks or a month and have another one and really learn. A lot of men are nervous in this space. They don't want to say the wrong things. They're not sure how to support and not take over and do the things that will be helpful. So what we found is really important to help men have spaces and learn how to do this and get out there, be a little uncomfortable, make progress. But I will tell you that still today, men have significantly more power in workplace settings than women. And men who become allies, really good allies, that know how to talk, know how to listen, know how to support, can be more powerful than women on these issues of strengthening and women and girls and making sure more thrive in workplace settings. And it gives men a bump to be in terms of being involved in these issues. Women sometimes not, but men, if you're involved in these kinds of issues and want to be male allies, you get some good attention in the workplace by women because we need more men, and men can influence other men as well.
Mm-hmm. I am a son, so that means I have a mother. I have three
Yes.
sisters. I'm married to a wonderful wife, but I have a daughter and a son.
Yeah.
If I want to help them grow up to be strong and amazing, wonderful people, based on your research, what's something I can do as a father and as a husband to champion their success and to help my daughter and my wife thrive?
Oh, great question. I really working, even though we have biases, really working on making sure that we're using similar messages about college when they grow up for both men and women, both our daughters and sons, encouraging, not limiting their, for instance, a lot of times we just give scientific or STEM area gifts to our sons and not our daughters. And some of that really has made it so women are not as interested in STEM areas when they have the capacity, when they have all of the what they need to intellectually to be successful. And so thinking about your daughters and sons, even talking about leadership, similar. Women can lead, men can lead. So let's talk to our daughters. We know from the research that girls have lower aspirations and ambitions to lead than boys. And that's because of the way we talk. And finally, I could give you a million, but finally, it is so common to talk to our daughters about their looks and not our sons. You're so beautiful. Beautiful dress. You're so cute today. All of that language focuses on external appearance. Even when you introduce your wife, I expect most husbands say, here's my beautiful wife. So that look, and so I've taught my husband, you can call me beautiful, but make sure smart or some other words are before that. But we have so many girls and young women growing up at social media is terrible with this too. Focused on that looks, the way they look is the most important thing. And we have to change that. Those are a few tips or a few things that I've found through the research and through practical experience through the years.
You called me out. Guilty as charged. This is my beautiful wife. All right. One question I like to ask everyone as we close. You're someone who's had a bit of professional success. You're an endowed professor. You're someone who has published a lot of impactful research. What advice do you have to someone who's trying to be successful in business, but maybe in your sphere as a professor, as a researcher, as an educator? What advice do you have for someone trying to be successful?
Well, I love that question. And I would really challenge people to think about what success means. And actually, the research says men and women think about that word differently. What is success? So there's different phases of research, but throughout any phase, what are you most passionate about? And is there a translation of that area into practice? You'll do more research for a while, but don't lose the thread of practice. So you can do something in the community along the way, maybe just a little bit, maybe some mentoring, maybe speaking on a topic, but start early to do a little bit, it in terms of taking the research and moving it to practice. And so I do think as a professor, it's so important. I laid down those initial early years, a whole slew of research. And I learned a lot about how to do qualitative and quantitative research through the years. And that's important as well. I'm glad I had those years. But again, think about how to move that so that people's workplace experiences are better. That something happens that really helps take that research to practice.
Wonderful. Dr. Susan R. Madsen, if people want to get connected with you, where do they find you? Where do they find your work?
Well, you can search Susan R. Madsen, and I come up a lot on there. But if you're interested in the Utah work, utwomen.org will get you to our Utah Women in Leadership Project website. And on that project website, you could also either on that website, or you can search abolderwayforward.org to look at the model. I have a 15-minute video there. It really is unique. And we're trying to do some really interesting things that if we can make progress here, I think it can move to other states and countries as well. We already have interest in that from other countries and states. And I'm like, give us a little bit of time to move a little bit forward. So thank you for having me on today.
Thank you very much for coming on. Everyone, thank you so much for watching the Psychology of Business podcast. Again, I've been your host, Dr. Brandon Griffin. Big thanks to Dr. Susan R. Madsen. But you have a great day and happy learning. We'll see you next time.